I'll go talk to my brother, so you go buy me a coffee in the meantime." "Understood." A man named Gary, who was in the midst of an affair with my wife Nancy at our house, claimed he was a mafia. I was taken to Gary's gang and, as ordered by Gary, I ran to buy coffee. However, as soon as I handed over the coffee, Gary's face twisted in anger. "You think you can get into our gang with this cheap coffee? Don't underestimate the Hawthorne gang, old man." I'm sorry." As I apologized, Gary threw it at me. Hearing Gary's loud voice, the gang members came out to see what was happening. As soon as they saw my face, they turned pale and started apologizing to me. "I'm really sorry, big brother. Our idiot has made a terrible mistake." Gary and Nancy were dumbfounded by the situation, not understanding what was happening. The executive stared sharply at Gary, who was dumbfounded, and began to explain. "My name is Tom. I'm a 43-year-old man who runs a restaurant. Though my life might not have been called normal up until now. I was told that my father passed away in an accident just after I was born, and I grew up living with just my mother. My mother was an optimistic woman who never lost her smile, always saying, 'Things will work out.' That life changed when I was in my 3rd year of junior high. During class, I was informed that my mother had collapsed in the street. I rushed to the hospital, but was told she had had a stroke and wouldn't live much longer. Suddenly faced with this, my head went blank, and the doctors and nurses asked me for contact information for any family or relatives, but as far as I knew, there were none. I had been told that my parents eloped and got married after a grand love affair, and there were absolutely no relatives from either side of the family. I ended up alone in the hospital room, watching my mother pass away. With the help of adults around me, I managed to hold a funeral, but I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't even cry, and my consciousness began to fade. Losing my beloved mother, I wondered how I was going to live from then on. I had been studying to go to high school, but now I probably had to find a job. As I was still unable to grasp the reality of being all alone and hung my head, I heard someone's voice. Did my sister pass away? When I turned around, there stood a large, intimidating man. I wondered who he was, but then he showed a gentle smile and ruffled my hair. The strength in his big, warm palms shook not just my head but my heart as well. "My name is Tyler. Your mother, she was my sister. If you've got nowhere to go, how about coming to my place?" I had never heard of my mother having a brother, so I was utterly bewildered. However, after paying respects to my mother's portrait, my uncle muttered softly. In the end, I couldn't do anything for my sister. Seeing his profile, which resembled my mother's, I finally succumbed to exhaustion and fell into a deep sleep. From then on, I was taken care of by my uncle. Arriving at my uncle's house, I was surprised to find it was a luxurious mansion, complete with a pool and opulent chandeliers. I'm not a good man. That's why my sister left home and cut ties with us. I'll let you stay here for a while, but it's up to you to decide what you want to do. I couldn't agree with his words at all. How could a man who went to such lengths for me, a nephew he had just met, be anything but good? Seeing my expression, my uncle continued. Listen, I'm a mafia. To the society, I'm nothing but a nuisance. If you don't like it here, you can leave any time. I'll provide for your living expenses, so don't worry. Despite his gruff words, he looked me straight in the eyes and spoke his mind. I wanted to believe in this man. I want to stay here. All right, I couldn't do much for my sister, but I'll take care of you until you're on your own. Later, I learned that my uncle and my mother's father, my grandfather, used to be the head of this gang. Growing up in a noisy household, my mother tirelessly protected my younger brother, almost like a second mother, always taking care of him. However, as my mother grew up, she became troubled by her status as the daughter of a gang leader and eloped with my father, who had no connections to that world. My grandfather was furious that my mother had run away and disowned her. But my uncle, who was close to his sister, secretly had people look for her afterward. My uncle knew where my mother and I were living a few years ago, but by that time, he had already become the head of the gang himself. He didn't want to show us that he had become the kind of gang leader my mother had hated enough to flee from. Upon learning of my mother's sudden death, he reached out to me, having watched over us from afar in silence until then. My uncle regretted not being able to speak to my mother in her final moments and made it up to me by treating me well. In return, I took good care of my uncle's son, Tony, who was 10 years younger than me and became like a cousin to me, and I chose to live in the world of the mafia. Tony grew very attached to me and looked up to me as if I were his real brother. However, one day, 10 years after living with my uncle, a conflict arose between the gangs, and as I was out with my uncle, mafia from a rival gang chased after us. While protecting my uncle, I was cornered on the edge of a cliff about 3 meters high. To protect my uncle from the men about to attack us, I instinctively jumped off the cliff holding him. I felt severe pain in my legs the moment we landed, but from the top of the cliff, only the surprised and fearful faces of our pursuers peeked down, and they did not follow us. Thus, I saved my uncle from danger, but my legs suffered critical injuries. Since my uncle is a mafia, we couldn't go to a regular hospital for treatment. I'm sorry. It's my fault. It's not your fault, Uncle. I'm just glad you're safe. In the end, I was left with after effects, and my legs no longer functioned properly. I have no trouble walking slowly, but standing for long periods or moving over long distances is challenging. Afterward, my uncle entrusted me with a restaurant under the gang's control, saying, "Perhaps my sister was right after all, Tom. From now on, live quietly away from us." Thus, I immersed myself in managing the restaurant, eventually expanding to several outlets. Before I knew it, about 20 years had passed, and I was leading a peaceful life. An incident disrupted my peaceful life. It all started when my wife brought a mafia member into our home. My wife Nancy is 8 years younger than me and was a regular customer who came to my restaurant every day for lunch. Given my leg condition, the restaurant was renovated to be barrier-free, eliminating steps at the entrance and inside. Nancy's first visit was when she was injured, and she was moved by the thoughtful design throughout the restaurant, becoming a fan of our place. Since then, even after her leg healed, Nancy continued to come for meals every day. Naturally, Nancy and I started talking, and I was gradually drawn to her bright and kind personality. Realizing Nancy felt the same way, we dated for 2 years before getting married. I did inform my uncle, but he only said, "As long as Tom is happy, that's all that matters." I wonder if, in my uncle's eyes, I no longer exist since I left the house. Honestly, it feels lonely. But I also thought it was time to stop relying on my uncle and start living on my own. I never told Nancy about my upbringing or past. So, I thought we would continue to live a life unrelated to the gang. With that in mind, our peaceful days passed by leisurely. Then, one day, an unexpected person visited my restaurant. "You look well, Tony. It's been a while." My uncle's son, Tony, had grown up in the 20 years, and now he was the gang's underboss. "It's been about 20 years since we last met. I have something I want to tell you today." With that preface, Tony shared something with me. "No way, I can't believe this." "It's up to you to decide what to do next. I'll be going now." I was too shocked by what I had just heard to move. But somehow, I managed to move my unsteady legs and see Tony off. Then, Tony showed a timid expression, like that of a small child. "Even if you think that time will come, it's still scary when it does. If anything happens, contact me immediately, Tony. You're important family to me." As I encouraged him with a pat on the shoulder, Tony regained his cheerfulness and left the restaurant with a bright smile. I was concerned about what Tony had told me, but I was soon faced with an even more pressing issue of my own. Nancy's attitude had gradually become colder. When we first got married, she used to prepare delicious meals every day and wait for me to come home. I was truly happy to be welcomed by her smile. But as half a year, then a year passed, Nancy began to neglect her household duties. Our conversations became perfunctory, and at times, she would ignore me completely when I spoke to her. She would leave meals and laundry undone, withdraw money from my account without permission, dress up flamboyantly like she was still single, and go out at all hours without any regard for day or night. Not knowing when she would return, I tried emailing her, but her address had been changed, and I couldn't reach her. When I tried calling her, it seemed like she had blocked my number. There wasn't even a ring, and we were completely out of touch. Since she would return late at night, our lifestyles became completely misaligned as I had to be up early for work. After living like strangers within our own home for about 3 months, I found staying in our empty, messy house unbearable and started coming home as late as possible. However, that day, there happened to be fewer customers, and I let the part-time staff go home early. Realizing there wouldn't be any more customers, I decided to head home earlier than usual. Upon opening the front door and seeing Nancy's high heels, I thought it was rare for her to be home. But at the same time, I noticed an unfamiliar pair of men's shoes next to hers, which made my heart start pounding. I broke out in a cold sweat, my body heated up, but strangely, my nerves became sharper. I immediately suspected infidelity, but I also considered the possibility that she might just have a friend over. So I decided not to go to the living room and instead headed upstairs to my room. But as I quietly entered the house, I heard Nancy and her companion talking loudly. I thought I married a rich man, but he turned out to be a total dud. But he's a boss, right? Owning several restaurants should be good enough. The person she was talking to was a man, and someone I didn't know. But his restaurants are just in this area, and so mediocre, it's disgusting how he limps when he walks. You are so much younger and prettier than him, Nancy. It's a waste to be with someone like that. Why don't you leave him? To the man's words, Nancy laughed heartily in response. But I hate working for a living now. I want to make my husband work while I have fun and live freely with you, Gary. As Nancy laughed out loud, the man named Gary also joined in with a coarse laugh. But you married him, so you must have liked him at some point, right? Stop joking. I never liked that shabby man. I thought he had money because he owned popular restaurants, so I was just a little nice to him, and he proposed on his own. Hearing Nancy's words, I felt a deep, cold weight in my chest. I had never imagined that Nancy thought of me in such a way, even though we had been together all this time. What a terrible woman, using your partner's wealth while cheating on him with me. I've been getting bored, so I've been completely ignoring him, waiting for him to bring up breaking up. I'm planning to squeeze as much money out of him as possible for alimony. This was the gist of Nancy and Gary's conversation. In other words, Nancy had planned this from the beginning, marrying me for my wealth. Shocked beyond words, I stood frozen at the entrance, listening to their cheerful conversation. But I couldn't just keep listening forever. Before I knew it, quite some time had passed since I entered the house. Feeling that I needed to settle this, I bravely stepped inside and flung open the living room door. Hey, I need an explanation for this. This scene that unfolded before me was exactly what I had anticipated. Nancy was in the midst of an affair with a man named Gary. Surprised by my sudden appearance, Nancy just kept muttering in shock, "Oh, why are you here? How long have you been home?" While Nancy was visibly shaken, Gary, on the other hand, looked at me with a defiant smirk. Hey, you are supposed to knock before entering, man." With a smug grin plastered on his face, Gary casually moved away from Nancy. Seeing Gary's composed demeanor, Nancy seemed to be influenced by him as well. Forgetting her earlier panic, She calmly adjusted her hair and retorted with a defiant look, "What do you mean? It's exactly as you see. Is there a need for an explanation?" At their attitude, I felt even heavier in my heart. "So, it's true. You never really loved me from the start." "Love? Of course not. Why would someone young and cute like me get close to an old man like you?" She burst out laughing loudly. "Did you really think you were loved all this time? You must have been very happy in your delusion. I just wanted to marry a rich man because I didn't want to work." After saying that, Nancy deliberately snuggled up to Gary. "When I was looking for a suitable marriage partner, I found you, who looked like you could be easily deceived. You own several restaurants, and I thought I could ingratiate myself with you, especially since you have a physical disadvantage. Nancy here says so too. Stop deluding yourself that you were loved. Just pay up quietly and get lost." Interrupted by Gary, I couldn't hold back and retorted, "Why should I be the one to pay? It's obviously for the alimony. Apologize for the mental anguish you've caused by marrying a young and beautiful woman like Nancy." What they were saying was absurd. Nancy, acting as if it didn't concern her, leaned against Gary and twirled her hair. Unable to bear the sight of her, I muttered disdainfully, "The one who suffered mental anguish is me. I'll be the one demanding alimony from you too." "What did you say? Don't you dare talk back to me. I'm a mafia, from the Hawthorne Group, no less. We're a big deal around here." Gary advanced on me, his nostrils flaring with anger. However, I was taken aback by the name he mentioned. "Are you really from the Hawthorne Group? You doubt me? Don't mess with me. I'm Gary from the Hawthorne Group." Gary glared at me, grinding his teeth and putting force into his words. In the next moment, I pleaded with Gary, "Please, take me to your group." "Huh? You want to join our group?" Gary looked bewildered for a moment, then scoffed irritably. "An old man like you wanting to become a mafia now is just a nuisance. If you're really set on it, you should at least bring some money first." "I'll pay, but first, could you take me to the Hawthorne Group?" By this time, I had completely forgotten about Nancy. Knowing that Gary was a member of the Hawthorne Group, all I could think about was meeting the boss. As I kept insisting, Nancy murmured in disgust, "What's with this guy? So lame." But I couldn't care less about that. I'm not sure how much time passed as I continued to plead. Gary sighed in annoyance. "Fine, follow me right now." Seeing that, Gary took Nancy and me to the car. In the car, Nancy mocked me multiple times. "You're in your 40s and want to become a mafia. You can't even walk properly. How could you be of any use?" But Nancy meant nothing to me now. Thinking simply that I would divorce her once everything was settled, I patiently waited to arrive at the group's location. "We're here. I'll go talk to my brother, so you go buy me a coffee in the meantime." Understood. I left the large gate of the group's compound and quickly went around to buy coffee. Returning to the compound, I met Gary just as he was coming back to the entrance. As soon as I handed him the coffee, his face twisted in anger. "With this cheap coffee, you think you can join the group? Old man, don't underestimate the Hawthorne Group." I'm sorry. As I apologized, Gary threw it at me. Then, perhaps hearing Gary's loud voice, other members of the group came out to see what was happening. "Hey Gary, what's all this commotion? This old man says he wants to join a group now, but he can't even buy a proper coffee, so I was just setting him straight." Hearing Gary's words, the member frowned slightly and looked at me. "You didn't have to make such a fuss. Have I seen you somewhere before?" The member who was scolding Gary peered into my face and started to ponder. Who could it be? Suddenly, the member shouted and turned pale, rushing back inside. He quickly returned, bringing with him a group of executives. They were all tough-looking men, and Nancy, as well as Gary, turned pale, wondering what was happening. "Gentlemen, what brings you all here together?" "You How did you come to meet him?" With that shout, one of the executives grabbed Gary. The other executives turned pale and began to apologize to me. "We're terribly sorry, Big Brother Tom. Our idiot has caused you a great disrespect." "No, it's okay." Seeing me speak to the executives as equals, Gary turned red and started to rant. "It was this old man who asked me. He wanted to join a group, so I just brought him here. This man here, he's a legendary mafia. Without him, the Hafan group would have been long gone." Upon hearing the executive's words, both Gary and Nancy were dumbfounded and couldn't grasp the situation. The executive glared at the bewildered Gary and began to explain. "He, 20 years ago, risked his life to save our boss." This old man did. What do you mean?" Finally changing his attitude towards me, I took the opportunity to explain further to Gary. "This is the home I grew up in. I used to be a mafia too. We became mafia after he had already left this house. It's an honor to see your face again after such a long time." The executive then spoke in a lowered voice. "Did you come today to meet the boss, by any chance?" "Yeah, Tony came to see me the other day and explained the situation, but my uncle didn't seem willing to let me in here, so I was in trouble. In fact, I had found out that my uncle had a heart condition and was given only 6 months to live. He was advised to undergo surgery, but the success rate was only 40%. Tony had told me this, and I wanted to see my uncle right away, but Tony shook his head and said that my uncle wanted me to grasp a normal happiness and never to re-enter the mafia life. My father always regretted what happened to you, Tom. He felt sorry and wanted you to live a happy life. Given this background, even if I had approached the group directly, I probably wouldn't have been allowed in due to my uncle's instructions." That's when Gary, who turned out to be an incidental adulterer from the Hafan group, appeared, and I fought to seek his cooperation. Upon learning everything, Gary trembled and began to apologize. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea about any of this. Please forgive me." As repeated apologies, so loud they might have grated the ground, seemed to annoy someone because more people came out from the back. It was Tony, the underboss himself. Seeing me, Tony's eyes widened in surprise. "Big Brother Tom, how did you get in here?" "By chance, I found someone willing to help." As the executives explained the situation to Tony, he raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Huh? Big Brother Tom got cheated on, huh? Well, guess this is my limit as a man." Tony frowned even more at my nonchalant laugh. "That's nonsense. There's no one more manly than you, Big Brother Tom, so what will you do about that man?" Before I could answer, one of the executives stepped forward. "There's no need to bother the underboss with this. Gary will be expelled. He's tarnished the group's name, and he'll have to take full responsibility." With that, the executive took the now subdued Gary and disappeared somewhere. Then Nancy chimed in from the side. Desperately trying to charm me, she began to plead for forgiveness, doing her best to persuade me. "I have nothing to do with this, right? It was just an affair, wasn't it? Affairs are unacceptable, mafia or not." Nancy shrank back at Tony's vehement anger, which caused a vein to bulge on his forehead. That's when I stepped forward, restraining Tony, and faced Nancy. "If it was just an affair, maybe I would share some of the blame, but you've been scheming from before we even got married, haven't you?" That is. She must have remembered admitting that she married me for my money. Nancy began to sweat and frantically looked around for an escape. "But you also hid the fact that you came from a mafia background. That makes us even, doesn't it?" "Certainly, it was wrong of me to hide my past, but you were trying to deceive me for money. Isn't that much worse than hiding being a mafia?" At my words, Nancy just hung her head and started to cry quietly, unable to respond. That's when Tony stepped in. "You really did a number on Tom, didn't you? Don't think he'll get off easy for this." The calmness of his voice somehow made the silence even more pronounced. Ever since our uncle fell, Tony had been effectively running the organization internally as the de facto leader. Thus, Tony's words carried the weight of a leader's, and everyone obeyed. "Take her away." At Tony's command, the members took Nancy away. I later received the divorce papers, but that was the last time I saw Nancy in person. I'll leave the rest to you. Leaving those words behind, I started walking towards my uncle's room. My uncle was lying in a large room, quietly closing his eyes. "Uncle." "Tom, I told you not to come. You're free now. You can live your life. Forget about me." Unable to bear hearing my uncle's stifled voice, I knelt down and grabbed his hand. The first day we met, he patted my head with his large, warm, and strong hand. Now, that same hand feels thin, cold, and considerably smaller. "Uncle, you once said you regretted not meeting my mother before she passed away." "That's..." My uncle seemed to choke on his words, reminded of his own past statements. I gripped his hand tighter. "I would surely regret it if I didn't come and see you. That's why I came. I'm living freely." "You got me there," my uncle replied with a hearty laugh. And so, I decided to stay by my uncle's side, from his hospitalization through to surgery. On the day of the surgery, Tony and I went to encourage him, and the surgery was a success. Now, he's slowly regaining his lost strength and spending his days peacefully. Afterward, Gary was excommunicated and lost the right to use the organization's name. Without the ability to return to a normal life, he wandered from job to job until his funds ran dry. When he applied for welfare, it was denied due to strict laws against organized crime. Eventually, without any money left, he had to beg for loans from associates, and unable to pay the interest, he went bankrupt. As a result, he's apparently being made to do physical labor at sites related to the organization. He works to the point of exhaustion every day, gradually paying off his debt bit by bit. As for Nancy, it seems she was forced to work in a nightclub. Due to embezzlement from her affairs and the substantial debt she accrued for my alimony, she reportedly works tirelessly from morning till night without a day off, serving customers. Because of the exhaustion, she aged rapidly. Although she's still in her 30s, she looks almost 50. Once her appearance deteriorated, she was relegated to cleaning, being worked to the bone. As for me, my uncle was finally discharged from the hospital, and we held a celebration at the organization. Having been away for 20 years, I could see how much my uncle had aged, and it brought a lump to my throat. "Thank you for saving me. I'm truly grateful you took me in that day." Expressing my sincere gratitude, my uncle just nodded deeply without saying a word. He decided to pass the leadership to Tony, and he retired. For his retirement, he chose to help out at the restaurant I run. He always had a passion for coffee, and now he serves as a taciturn barista, offering delicious coffee to our customers. Sometimes, Tony visits the shop between his duties, and we compare coffees, enjoying satisfying moments. I plan to continue repaying the kindness my uncle showed me in the past and live peacefully.